The mountain man, with shoulders broad as an ox yoke, heard a sound that stopped him cold in the middle of skinning an elk, a laugh so rich and full-bodied it seemed to roll down the Wyoming mountainside like summer thunder. And he knew in that instant his solitary life was about to change forever. Cade Mercer had lived alone in these mountains for 6 years, ever since the war had ended in 1865, and he decided civilization held nothing for him anymore. He was 24 now, though his sun-weathered face and the hardness in his gray eyes made him look older. His dark hair hung past his shoulders, tied back with a strip of leather, and his arms were corded with muscle from years of splitting wood, hauling water, and wrestling the wilderness into submission. He stood well over 6 feet, with a chest like a barrel and hands that could snap a rifle stock or gentle a frightened animal with equal ease. The laugh came again, floating through the pine trees that surrounded his cabin, and Cade straightened, his knife still in his hand, blood from the elk staining his fingers. It was a woman's laugh, unrestrained and joyful, the kind of sound he hadn't heard in so long he'd almost forgotten such things existed. Out here, 30 miles from the nearest settlement of Pinewood, visitors were rare. Traders came twice a year, trappers sometimes passed through, but women, never. He wiped his hands on his leather breeches and moved toward the sound with the silent grace of a man who'd learned to walk without disturbing the forest floor. Through the trees, he spotted a small camp, a canvas tent barely big enough for one person, a struggling fire that was more smoke than flame, and a woman crouched beside it, laughing at something with such genuine delight that Cade found himself stopping just to listen. She looked to be in her early 20s, with auburn hair that caught the afternoon sunlight and turned it into copper fire. Her dress was practical calico, faded from travel and patched at the elbows, and her boots were those of someone who'd done a lot of walking. She was alone, which made no sense at all, and she was laughing at a chipmunk that had stolen a piece of hardtack from beside her fire and was now sitting on a rock, holding it like a prize. "You earned it fair and square," she told the chipmunk, wiping tears from her eyes. "Faster than me, that's for certain." Her voice had the warm roundness of someone from back east, maybe Pennsylvania or Ohio, and it carried the same joy as her laugh. Cade found himself smiling, an expression that felt foreign on his face, and then he stepped on a twig that snapped like a gunshot. The woman spun, and he saw her face clearly for the first time, freckles scattered across her nose, green eyes wide with alarm, and a hand reaching for what looked like a very old pistol tucked into her belt. "Easy," Cade said, raising his hands, still holding the knife but pointing it away from her. "I'm not here to cause trouble." She didn't relax, and he couldn't blame her. He knew what he looked like, massive, wild-haired, covered in elk blood, and emerging from the forest like some kind of beast. Her hand stayed on the pistol, though he noticed it was shaking. "Who are you?" she demanded, and her voice had lost its warmth, replaced with the sharp edge of fear. "Name's Cade Mercer. I've got a cabin about a quarter mile that way." He nodded toward the north. "Heard you laughing and came to see who was fool enough to be camped out here alone." "I'm not a fool," she said, though the tremor in her voice suggested she was beginning to question that assessment. "I'm just passing through." "Passing through to where?" Cade asked, lowering his hand slowly. "Nearest town is Pinewood, and that's 2 days' walk down the mountain. Next nearest is 4 days beyond that." The woman's jaw tightened, and he saw her swallow hard. "I'm aware of the distances. Are you aware you've set up camp in a spot where the wind's going to tear that tent apart come nightfall, and that your fire isn't going to last another hour the way you've built it?" She glanced at her fire, which chose that moment to sputter pathetically, and some of the defiance left her face. I'm learning as I go." "That's a dangerous way to learn out here." Cade sheathed his knife and took a step closer, moving slowly so as not to spook her. "How long have you been on your own?" 3 weeks, she admitted, and then seemed angry at herself for telling him. "I can manage." 3 weeks and you're still alive, so I guess you can," Cade said. "But winter's coming early this year. I can smell it in the air. You planning to walk to Pinewood before the snow hits?" "That's my business." "Fair enough." Cade studied her for a moment longer, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the way her dress hung loose on her frame. She was hungry, exhausted, and scared, but there was something stubborn in the set of her shoulders that he recognized. She reminded him of a wild horse he'd once tried, to gentle, proud, fierce, and determined not to show weakness. He made a decision that probably wasn't wise, but felt inevitable nonetheless. "I've got an elk I'm working on. More meat than I can eat before it spoils. You're welcome to share it, and I can show you how to build a proper fire before I head back." Suspicion warred with hunger in her eyes. "Why would you help me?" "Because I remember what it's like to be alone and not know what I'm doing," Cade said simply. "And because nobody deserves to starve in the wilderness if they don't have to." She studied him for a long moment, and he stood still, letting her look her fill. He knew what she was trying to determine, whether he was a threat, whether she could trust him, whether accepting help was worth the risk. Finally, she gave a small nod. "My name is Eleanor Hastings," she said, taking her hand off the pistol. "And I would be grateful for the help, Mr. Mercer." "Just Cade," he said, and felt something shift in his chest when she smiled, a small, cautious smile that didn't reach her eyes but held the promise of that laugh he'd heard earlier. He spent the next hour showing her how to build a fire that would last, how to bank the coals properly, and where to position her tent so the wind wouldn't flatten it. She was a quick learner, asking smart questions and paying close attention to everything he said. When he brought her a haunch of elk meat, already butchered and wrapped in oilcloth, her eyes went wide. "This is too much," she protested. "It'll spoil if you don't take it," Cade said. "I've got plenty, and you need it more than I do." "I don't have money to pay you." "Didn't ask for any." Eleanor looked at the meat, then at him, and he saw her throat work as she swallowed. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Truly. I don't know why you're being kind, but thank you." "You're welcome." Cade turned to leave, then paused. "Miss Hastings, if you don't mind my asking, why are you out here alone? You running from something?" Her face closed off immediately, and he knew he'd pushed too far. "That's my business, as I said." "All right," he nodded. "But if you need help, real help, my cabin's got a good roof and walls that'll stand up to the snow. I can show you the way before I leave you be." "I'll manage," she said again, but this time it sounded less certain. Cade left her to her camp and made his way back to his cabin, but he couldn't stop thinking about Eleanor Hastings and her laugh that seemed to shake the trees. That night, lying in his bed of furs and listening to the wind pick up outside, he wondered what had driven a woman like her into the wilderness alone. Whatever it was, it had to be serious. Women didn't just wander into the mountains without a reason, especially not women who sounded like they'd been raised in parlors and proper society. The next morning, he woke to the smell of snow in the air. The sky was heavy with clouds, and the temperature had dropped enough that his breath misted in front of his face. He knew what was coming: an early storm, the kind that could dump 2 feet of snow in a night and leave someone unprepared, frozen and dead by morning. He tried to tell himself it wasn't his problem. Eleanor Hastings was a grown woman who'd made her own choices, but he kept hearing that laugh, kept seeing the stubborn tilt of her chin and the fear hidden behind her bravado, and he knew he couldn't just let her face the storm alone. He packed a second set of furs, extra food, and rope, then made his way back to her camp. When he arrived, he found her trying to reinforce her tent with pine branches, her hands clumsy with cold. "Storm's coming," he said by way of greeting. "Big one. You won't survive it in that tent." Eleanor looked up at him, and he saw the fear that she'd been hiding. "How long do I have?" "Few hours, maybe less." Cade set down his pack. "You need to come to my cabin. It's the only shelter for miles that'll stand up to what's coming." "I can't impose on you like that." "You'll die if you don't," Cade said bluntly, "and I'm not going to have that on my conscience. Pack what you need. We don't have time to argue." For a moment, he thought she might refuse anyway, and he prepared himself to throw her over his shoulder and carry her if necessary. But then she nodded, her face pale, and started gathering her belongings with shaking hands. They made it to his cabin just as the first snowflakes started to fall. By the time Cade had secured the door and lit the fire in his stone hearth, the world outside had disappeared into a white wall of swirling snow. Eleanor stood in the middle of his one-room cabin, clutching her small pack and looking around with wide eyes. The cabin was simple but solid: a large bed in one corner, a table and 2 chairs he'd built himself, shelves lined with supplies, and the hearth that took up most of one wall. Animal skins covered the floor and hung on the walls for extra insulation, and the whole place smelled of wood smoke and the herbs he dried for cooking. "You can have the bed," Cade said, adding wood to the fire. "I'll sleep on the floor." "I can't take your bed." "You can and you will. I've slept in worse places." He glanced at her and saw she was shivering. Get closer to the fire. You're half frozen. Eleanor moved to the hearth and held out her hands to the warmth. In the firelight, he could see her more clearly, the way her hair curled around her face where it had escaped its pins, the delicate line of her jaw, the full curve of her mouth. She was beautiful in a way that made his chest ache, all warmth and life and light in his dark, lonely cabin. "This storm," she said quietly. "How long will it last?" "Hard to say. Could be a day, could be 3. Cade hung his coat on a peg by the door. "We've got plenty of food and firewood. We'll be fine." "I'm sorry," Eleanor said suddenly. "I'm sorry for being such a burden. You must think I'm the most foolish woman alive." "I think you're brave," Cade said, surprising himself with the honesty. "Foolish maybe, but brave. Not many people would try to cross these mountains alone." She turned to look at him, and something in her expression shifted. "You want to know why I'm out here? Only if you want to tell me." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When she spoke, her voice was soft but steady. "I was supposed to marry a man in Philadelphia, Richard Thornton. My father arranged it. Richard was wealthy, established, everything a father wants for his daughter, but he was also cruel, not in obvious ways, not at first. Small things. Comments that made me feel small, hands that gripped too tight when no one was looking, and I realized that if I married him, I would spend the rest of my life making myself smaller and smaller until there was nothing left." Cade felt anger kindle in his gut, hot and fierce. "Your father knew?" "I tried to tell him. He said I was being dramatic, that all men were like that I needed to grow up and accept my responsibilities." Eleanor laughed, but it was nothing like the sound he'd first heard. This laugh was bitter and broken. "So I ran. I took what money I'd saved, bought a ticket west, and kept going until I couldn't go any farther. I thought maybe if I got far enough away, I could figure out who I was supposed to be." "And you ended up in the mountains?" "I heard Pinewood was a mining town, that they needed teachers. I thought maybe I could start over there." She wrapped her arms around herself. "But I underestimated how difficult the journey would be. By the time I realized I was in over my head, turning back seemed as impossible as going forward." Cade moved to stand beside her, close enough that he could feel the cold still radiating from her skin. "You're not a burden, Eleanor. You're someone who chose freedom over safety. That takes strength." She looked up at him, and he saw tears shining in her green eyes. "I don't feel strong. I feel terrified and lost and so very tired." "Strength doesn't mean not being afraid," Cade said. "It means doing what needs to be done even when you are." A tear slipped down her cheek, and without thinking, Cade reached up and brushed it away with his thumb. Her skin was soft as silk under his calloused hand, and he felt her intake of breath, saw her pupils dilate. The air between them suddenly felt charged, heavy with possibility and something he didn't dare name. "You're safe here," he said, his voice rough. "I give you my word. Whatever you're running from, it can't reach you while you're with me." "Why?" Eleanor whispered. "Why are you helping me? You don't know me." Cade dropped his hand, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. "Because when I was 20, I came back from the war with nothing, no family, no home, no idea who I was anymore. And an old trapper named Josiah took me in, taught me how to survive out here, gave me a reason to keep living. He died 2 years ago, and before he did, he made me promise that if I ever had the chance to help someone the way he helped me, I would." "I'm sorry about your friend." "So am I." Cade stepped back, needing distance. "But that's why I'm helping you, not because I expect anything in return, but because someone once did the same for me." Eleanor nodded slowly, wiping her eyes. "Then I'll say the same thing to you that I'm sure you said to Josiah. Thank you. From the bottom of my heart, thank you." Outside, the storm howled, rattling the shutters and piling snow against the walls. Inside, Cade made them dinner elk stew with wild onions and herbs, accompanied by the hard bread he'd baked the week before. Eleanor ate like someone who'd been half-starved, which she probably had been, and when she was finished, she helped him clean the dishes with a domesticity that felt both foreign and deeply right. Tell me about your life here," Eleanor said as she dried the tin plates. "What do you do all day?" "Hunt, mostly. Trap in the winter. I trade furs and pine wood twice a year for supplies I can't make myself. The rest of the time I chop wood, maintain the cabin, fish in the stream when it's not frozen." He shrugged. "It's a simple life, but it's mine. Don't you get lonely?" "Sometimes," Cade admitted, "but I got used to my own company. After the war, being around people felt wrong. Too noisy, too crowded. Out here, things make sense." "What did you do before the war?" "Worked on my father's farm in Missouri. We raised horses." He stared into the fire, remembering. "My parents and younger sister died of cholera the year before I enlisted. I joined up because I didn't know what else to do with myself. Turns out I was good at fighting, but it didn't make me feel any better about losing them." Eleanor reached out and touched his arm, a gentle pressure that somehow anchored him. "I'm sorry. I can't imagine losing everyone like that. We all lose people. That's just life." Cade looked down at her hand on his arm, small and pale against his sun-darkened skin. "But we keep going anyway." "Yes," Eleanor said softly. "We do." That night, Eleanor slept in his bed while Cade made a pallet of furs near the fire. He lay awake for a long time, listening to her breathe and thinking about how strange it was to have another person in his space. Strange, but not unwelcome. There was something peaceful about knowing she was there, safe and warm, no longer alone in the wilderness. The storm lasted 3 days, and in that time, Cade discovered several things about Eleanor Hastings. She was curious about everything, asking him 100 questions about how he lived, what he knew about the plants and animals, how he'd built his cabin. She was funny too, with a dry wit that caught him off guard and made him laugh more than he had in years. And when she laughed, really laughed, with her whole body it filled the cabin with warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. On the second day, she laughed so hard at a story he told about a raccoon that had stolen his entire store of sugar that she actually snorted, which made her laugh even harder, clutching her sides and gasping for breath. Cade found himself grinning like a fool, thinking that he'd tell 1,000 stories if it meant hearing that sound again. "You said my laugh shook trees," Eleanor said when she finally caught her breath. "I think that's the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me." "It's true," Cade said. "First time I heard it, I thought it was thunder." She smiled at him, soft and sweet, and he felt something in his chest crack open. He was in trouble, he realized. Deep, complicated trouble. Because Eleanor Hastings, with her courage and her laughter and her green eyes, was working her way under his skin, and he didn't know how he was going to let her go when the storm passed. On the third day, the snow stopped and the sun came out, turning the world into a blinding expanse of white. Cade dug out the door and surveyed the damage. At least 3 feet of snow, maybe more in the drifts. The trail to Pinewood would be impassable for at least a week, probably longer. Eleanor stood beside him in the doorway, wrapped in one of his fur cloaks, and stared at the transformed landscape. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "It's deadly," Cade corrected, "but yes, also beautiful." "How long before I can continue to Pinewood?" The question hit him like a physical blow, and he realized he'd been hoping she wouldn't ask. "Depends on the weather. Could be a week, could be a month. The trail's dangerous even in good conditions. After a storm like this, it's near impossible." Eleanor nodded, her expression unreadable. Then I suppose I'm imposing on your hospitality a while longer?" "It's not an imposition." Cade turned to face her. "You're welcome here, Eleanor, for as long as you need." She looked up at him, searching his face for something he didn't understand. "Why do I feel like if I stay, I'll never want to leave?" "Would that be so bad?" The words were out before he could stop them, and he saw her eyes widen. "Cade, I know it's too soon," he said quickly. "I know you barely know me, and you're running from one situation you didn't choose. I'm not trying to trap you into another. But I want you to know that if you stayed, if you chose to stay, I would spend every day making sure you never regretted it." Eleanor's lips parted, and for a moment he thought she might say yes. But then she shook her head, a sad smile on her face. "I can't make decisions like that right now. I need time to figure out who I am without someone else defining it for me." "I understand." And he did, even though it hurt. "But the offer stands. No pressure, no expectations, just know that you have a choice." She reached up and touched his bearded cheek, her hand gentle. "You're a good man, Cade Mercer. Better than you know." The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm that felt almost like a dream. Cade taught Eleanor how to track animals in the snow, how to ice fish, how to read the weather and the color of the sky. She proved to be a natural shot with his rifle, which surprised both of them, and she laughed with pure delight the first time she brought down a rabbit on her own. "Did you see that?" she crowed, dancing through the snow to retrieve her prize. "I actually hit it." "I saw," Cade said, grinning at her enthusiasm. "You're a natural hunter." "Or I'm just lucky." But her eyes sparkled with pride, and when she laughed, it echoed through the pine trees, shaking snow from the branches. He kept finding excuses to make her laugh, telling stories, doing terrible impressions of the animals they saw, once even pretending to lose a wrestling match with a particularly bold squirrel. Each time she laughed, he felt something in his heart expand, like a frozen river thawing in spring. Eleanor, for her part, brought life to his cabin in ways he hadn't expected. She sang while she cooked, old songs from her childhood that filled the space with melody. She organized his shelves, mended his clothes, and insisted on teaching him proper table manners, which led to a hilarious dinner where they both tried to eat with exaggerated refinement before dissolving into laughter. "You're supposed to dab your mouth with the napkin, not wipe your entire face," Eleanor said, trying to maintain a straight face, as Cade deliberately made a mess of it. "Like this?" He dragged the cloth across his face like he was scrubbing a floor. "Cade!" She threw a piece of bread at him, which he caught and ate in one bite, making her laugh so hard she nearly fell off her chair. At night, they sat by the fire and talked about everything and nothing. She told him about growing up in Philadelphia, about the books she'd read and the places she'd dreamed of seeing. He told her about his childhood on the farm, about breaking horses with his father, about the sister who'd followed him everywhere and made flower crowns for his hair. "I wish I could have met her," Eleanor said. "She sounds wonderful." She was. "You remind me of her sometimes, the way you see joy in small things." Cade poked at the fire, watching the sparks fly. "She would have liked you." "I hope so." One night, about a month after Eleanor had arrived, Cade woke to find her standing at the window, wrapped in furs and staring out at the moonlit snow. He rose quietly and joined her, close enough to feel her warmth. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "I keep thinking about Pinewood," Eleanor said, "about what happens when the snow melts and the trail opens up." "What do you want to happen?" "I don't know." She turned to face him, and in the moonlight, her face was ethereal, like something from a dream. "When I first came here, all I wanted was to escape, to start over somewhere new. But now I wonder if starting over means going somewhere else or if it means letting myself be happy right where I am." Cade's heart hammered against his ribs. "Are you happy here?" "I am," Eleanor whispered. "Happier than I've been in years, maybe ever. And that terrifies me because I don't know if it's real or if I'm just grateful to be safe." "It's real," Cade said, and he couldn't keep the roughness from his voice. "What's between us, it's real, Eleanor. At least it is for me." "For me too, she admitted. "But what if I stay and then realize I made a mistake? What if I'm just running from one life into another without thinking it through?" "Then you leave," Cade said simply. "I won't stop you. I won't even ask you to stay if that's not what you want. But Eleanor, I think you already know what you want. I think you're just afraid to reach for it." She stared up at him, her green eyes searching his face. "What if I disappoint you?" "You couldn't." "What if you disappoint me? Then I'll spend every day trying to make it right." He reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, letting his hand linger. "I'm not perfect, Eleanor. I'm rough and I'm scarred and I've got a temper when pushed. But I'm honest and I'm loyal and I would never, ever hurt you the way that man in Philadelphia did." "I know," she said, and her voice was thick with emotion. "I've known that from the start. You're gentle, Cade, in all the ways that matter." "Then stay," he said, finally letting himself ask. "Not forever if you don't want. But stay through spring, see what it's like here when everything blooms. If you still want to go to Pinewood after that, I'll take you myself. But give us a chance to see what this could be." Eleanor closed her eyes and he saw a tear slide down her cheek. When she opened them again, they were shining with something that made his breath catch. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll stay." Cade pulled her into his arms and she came willingly, burying her face in his chest. He held her like she was something precious, something he'd been searching for his whole life without knowing it. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled at the moon. But inside the cabin, wrapped in warmth and possibility, they stood together and let themselves hope. The next morning, everything felt different. Not in any obvious way, they still did the same chores, ate the same breakfast, went about the same routines. But there was a new awareness between them, a tenderness in the way they moved around each other. Cade found himself touching Eleanor, more a hand on her back as he passed, fingers brushing hers when he handed her something, an arm around her shoulders when they stood outside watching the sunset. She responded in kind, leaning into him when they sat by the fire, playing with his hair when she thought he wasn't paying attention, laughing at his jokes with an openness that made his heart soar. 2 weeks later, the weather turned warmer, and the snow began to melt in earnest. Cade took Eleanor exploring, showing her the hidden places he'd discovered over the years, a waterfall frozen into a sculpture of ice, a cave where crystals sparkled in the darkness, a meadow where elk came to graze in the evening light. At the meadow, they lay on their backs in the snow and watched the clouds drift by, their breath misting in the cold air. "Tell me something you've never told anyone," Eleanor said suddenly. Cade thought about it. "Sometimes I talk to Josiah like he's still here. I'll be working on something and I'll ask him what he thinks, or I'll see something funny and imagine what he'd say about it. I know it's foolish, but it makes me feel less alone." "It's not foolish," Eleanor said. "I think it's beautiful. He clearly meant a lot to you." "He did." Cade turned his head to look at her. "Your turn." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "I used to imagine what it would be like to just disappear. Not die, but vanish into thin air and start over somewhere no one knew me. I thought about it so often I almost convinced myself it was impossible. And then I did it, and I discovered that starting over is the hardest, most terrifying thing I've ever done. But you did it anyway." "I did it anyway." "What?" she agreed. "And look where it led me. To a mountain man's cabin in the middle of nowhere. To a man with a laugh that makes me feel brave and arms that make me feel safe." Eleanor rolled onto her side, propping her head on her hand. "To someone who sees me for who I am and doesn't ask me to be anyone else." Cade reached over and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "I see someone extraordinary, someone strong and brave and full of light." "You make me want to be that person," Eleanor said. "When I'm with you, I feel like maybe I actually am." "You are," Cade said firmly. "You were before you met me. I just get the privilege of seeing it." Eleanor leaned in and kissed him, soft and sweet, and Cade felt the world narrow to the point where their lips met. He'd been kissed before, fumbling encounters in his youth that had meant nothing. But this was different. This was Eleanor, and she tasted like hope and possibility and home. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Eleanor was smiling. "I've been wanting to do that for weeks." "You could have," Cade said, his voice rough with want. "Any time. I needed to be sure. And now? Now I'm sure." She kissed him again, deeper this time, and Cade pulled her close, feeling the warmth of her body against his even through their layers of clothing. They stayed in the meadow until the sun began to set, kissing and talking and laughing, and when they finally made their way back to the cabin, hand in hand, Cade felt like a different man than the one who'd woken up that morning. He felt whole in a way he hadn't since before the war, like all the broken pieces of himself had finally found their way back together. Spring came slowly to the mountains, but when it finally arrived in earnest, it transformed the world. The snow melted into rushing streams, wildflowers carpeted the meadows, and the forest came alive with birdsong and new growth. Cade and Eleanor spent their days exploring, working on the cabin, and simply being together. And with each passing day, Cade fell more deeply in love. He loved the way she hummed while she worked, the way she left flowers in tin cups around the cabin, the way she challenged him to shooting contests she never won but always enjoyed. He loved her curiosity, her courage, her endless capacity for joy. And most of all, he loved her laugh, that deep, rolling, tree-shaking laugh that never failed to make him smile. He found himself doing ridiculous things just to hear it. Once, he pretended to lose a wrestling match with a young bear cub that wandered too close to the cabin, letting it climb all over him, while Eleanor laughed so hard she had to sit down. Another time, He attempted to teach her a dance his mother had taught him, which resulted in both of them tangled up and falling into a snowbank, her laughter ringing out across the mountain. "You're going to get yourself killed trying to make me laugh," Eleanor said, still giggling as she helped him up. "Worth it," Cade said, grinning at her. "Every time." One evening in late April, as they sat on the porch watching the stars come out, Eleanor said, "I don't want to go to Pinewood." Cade's heart stuttered. "You don't?" "No, I thought I did. I thought I needed civilization, a job, a purpose. But I realized I already have all those things here. With you." She turned to face him, her expression serious. "If you'll have me, I want to stay. Not just through spring, but always. I want to build a life here, with you." "Eleanor." Cade took her face in his hands, feeling the warmth of her skin, the realness of her. "There's nothing I want more. But are you sure? This life is hard. It's isolated. There won't be fancy dresses or dinner parties or any of the things you grew up with." "I don't want any of those things," Eleanor said. "I want this. I want you. I want to wake up every morning and see the mountains and know I'm exactly where I'm meant to be." Cade kissed her then, pouring everything he felt into it, his love, his gratitude, his absolute certainty that she was the best thing that had ever happened to him. When they broke apart, both of them were crying, tears of joy running down their faces. "Marry me," Cade said, the words tumbling out before he could think them through. "I know it's fast, and I know I don't have a ring or anything fancy to offer, but marry me, Eleanor. Let me spend the rest of my life making you happy." "Yes," Eleanor said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." They were married a month later in a simple ceremony performed by a traveling preacher who passed through on his way to Pinewood. The preacher, a grizzled old man named Thomas, seemed bemused by the couple standing before him, the massive mountain man with flowers woven into his hair, and the radiant woman in a simple white dress she'd sewn herself from fabric Cade had traded for in town. "Do you, Cade Mercer, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Thomas asked. "I do," Cade said, his voice steady despite the emotion churning in his chest. "And do you, Eleanor Hastings, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," Eleanor said, her smile bright enough to outshine the sun. "Then, by the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Cade pulled Eleanor into his arms and kissed her as the wind whispered through the pines and the birds sang overhead. When he pulled back, she was laughing that glorious tree-shaking laugh, and he knew he would never get tired of hearing it. The first year of their marriage was everything Cade had hoped for and more. Eleanor thrived in the mountains, proving herself to be as capable as any mountain woman despite her city upbringing. She learned to tan hides, preserve meat, identify medicinal plants, and shoot well enough to bring down a deer on her own. She also softened the hard edges of his life, bringing warmth and laughter and music to the cabin that had been silent for so long. They talked about everything, their pasts, their dreams, their fears. Eleanor told him about the brother she'd lost to scarlet fever when she was 12, about the mother who died giving birth to a stillborn child when Eleanor was 16. Cade told her about the nightmares he still had sometimes, about the friends he'd lost in the war, about the guilt he carried for surviving when so many hadn't. "You survived because you were meant to," Eleanor said one night, holding him close after a particularly bad dream. "You survived so you could be here, with me, building this life. That's not something to feel guilty about." "I know," Cade said. "But some nights I still wonder why I got to live when they didn't." "Because the world needed you," Eleanor said simply. "I needed you, even before I knew you existed." Those words settled something in him, a peace he hadn't realized he'd been searching for. With Eleanor beside him, the ghosts of his past seemed less haunting, the weight of his grief less crushing. She gave him hope, gave him joy, gave him a reason to wake up every morning with a smile on his face. In their second summer together, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. She told him one morning in August, her face glowing with joy and nervousness. "I'm going to have a baby," she said. "Our baby." Cade felt like all the air had been sucked from his lungs. "You're sure?" "I'm sure. I've suspected for a few weeks, but now I'm certain." She took his hand and placed it on her stomach. "We're going to be parents, Cade." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight, feeling emotions crash over him in waves: joy, fear, wonder, love so intense it hurt. "I'm going to be a father," he said, his voice cracking. "The best father," Eleanor said. "I know you will be." That winter, as Eleanor's belly grew round with their child, Cade threw himself into preparing. He built a cradle from smooth pine, lined it with the softest furs he could find. He stocked up on supplies, making 2 trips to Pinewood instead of his usual one, ignoring the knowing looks from the shopkeepers. He reinforced the cabin walls, made sure the roof was watertight, and hunted enough meat to last them through the coldest months. Eleanor, meanwhile, seemed to bloom with pregnancy. Her face grew fuller, her laugh even more frequent. She sang to her belly, told their unborn child stories, and made plans for all the things they would teach their son or daughter. "I want to teach them to read," she said one night, her hands on her stomach, "and to love books, and to see the beauty in everything, the way you've taught me." "I want to teach them to be strong," Cade said, "and kind, and to laugh the way you do, like joy is something that can't be contained." The baby came in early March, during a late snowstorm that trapped them inside for 3 days. Eleanor's labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Cade thought he might lose her, when the fear was so intense he could barely breathe. But Eleanor was strong, stronger than anyone he'd ever known, and when the dawn broke on the 3rd day, their son came into the world with a lusty cry that filled the cabin. "He's perfect," Eleanor said, cradling the tiny red-faced baby against her chest. "Look at him, Cade. He's perfect." Cade looked at his son, at the tiny fists and the shock of dark hair, and the eyes that would probably turn gray like his own, and felt his heart crack wide open. "What should we name him?" "Josiah," Eleanor said without hesitation, "after the man who saved you, so you could save me." Cade couldn't speak past the lump in his throat, so he just nodded and gathered his wife and son into his arms, holding them like the precious miracles they were. Josiah Mercer grew into a wild, happy child, as at home in the mountains as his parents. He had his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair, and by the time he was 3, he was following Cade around like a shadow, wanting to help with everything. "I do it, Papa," became his favorite phrase, whether he was trying to chop wood, skin a rabbit, or fix the roof. "He's just like you," Eleanor said, laughing as she watched their son attempt to lift an axe nearly as big as he was. "God help us all," Cade said, but he was grinning. When Josiah was 4, Eleanor became pregnant again, and this time the pregnancy was easier, the birth quicker. Their daughter came on a warm spring morning, with wildflowers blooming outside and birds singing in the trees. She had auburn hair like her mother, and a cry that could wake the dead. "What about Grace?" Cade suggested, looking at the tiny baby in his arms. "For the grace that brought us all together." "Grace Mercer," Eleanor said, trying it out. "I love it. Life with 2 children was chaotic and exhausting and absolutely wonderful." Cade and Eleanor fell into a rhythm of parenting that worked for them. He handled the heavy work and the outdoor teaching, while she managed the domestic side and the early education. But they both did everything, really. Cade could soothe a crying baby as well as Eleanor could track a deer, and they shared the load equally. The children grew up immersed in love and laughter. Cade made sure of that. He tickled them until they shrieked, told them outrageous stories, and played elaborate games of make-believe that left Eleanor shaking her head and smiling. And he made Eleanor laugh, constantly, because he'd learned that her laugh was the sound that made everything else worthwhile. When Josiah was 7 and Grace was 3, a family of settlers moved into a valley about 5 miles away. The Johnsons had come west looking for land and peace, and they were good people, hard-working and kind. They had 3 children close in age to Josiah, and suddenly the isolation that had defined Cade and Eleanor's life was broken. "It's good for them to have other children to play with," Eleanor said, watching Josiah run through the meadow with the Johnson boys. "It is," Cade agreed, "and it's good for us to have neighbors, even if they are 5 miles away." The Johnsons became close friends, and soon other families followed. Within a few years, a small community had formed in the mountains, drawn by the wild beauty and the promise of land. Cade and Eleanor found themselves at the center of it, the couple everyone turned to for advice, for help, for the kind of steady wisdom that came from years of surviving in the wilderness. A schoolhouse was built, and Eleanor became the teacher she'd originally planned to be in Pinewood. She taught the children reading and writing and arithmetic, and she did it with such joy that even the most reluctant students came to love learning. Cade, meanwhile, became the man people called on when there was trouble: a bear near someone's cabin, a neighbor who needed help building a barn, a child lost in the woods. He handled it all with quiet competence, and the community came to respect him as a leader, though he never asked for the position. But no matter how busy life became, Cade never forgot what mattered most. Every evening, after the children were in bed and the chores were done, he and Eleanor would sit on their porch and watch the stars come out. They'd talk about their day, make plans for the future, and simply be together. "Do you ever miss Philadelphia?" Cade asked one night, though he knew the answer. "Not even a little bit," Eleanor said. "This is my home. You're my home. Our family, our life here, this is everything I never knew I wanted." "I love you," Cade said, pulling her close, "more than anything in this world." "I love you too," Eleanor said. "Thank you for hearing my laugh that day. Thank you for not letting me face that storm alone. Thank you for giving me a reason to laugh every single day." "Always," Cade promised. "I'll spend the rest of my life finding reasons to make you laugh." And he did. Through all the years that followed, through the births of 3 more children, through harsh winters and bountiful summers, through illnesses and injuries and the inevitable challenges of life, Cade Mercer made sure his wife laughed. He told jokes, played pranks on the children that had them all giggling, and found joy in the smallest moments. Because he'd learned, on that day when he first heard a sound that seemed to shake the very trees, that laughter was the sound of life at its fullest. And Eleanor's laugh, rich and deep and absolutely uninhibited, was the sound of home. Years later, when Cade was 62 and Eleanor was 60, they sat on that same porch and watched their grandchildren play in the meadow. Josiah had built a cabin nearby with his wife, and Grace had married the Johnsons' youngest son and lived just over the hill. Their other 3 children were scattered but close, and the mountain community had grown into a small but thriving town. "We did good, didn't we?" Eleanor said, her hand in his. Her hair was gray now, her face lined with age, but her eyes still sparkled with the same light that had first captured him. "We did perfect," Cade said. His own hair was silver, his body marked by decades of hard work, but his strength was still there, and his love for the woman beside him had only grown deeper with time. "Tell me something," Eleanor said. "If you could go back to that day when you first heard me laughing, would you change anything?" "Not a single thing," Cade said without hesitation. "Every moment, every choice, every challenge, it all led us here. And here is exactly where I want to be." Eleanor squeezed his hand, and then she laughed that same glorious, tree-shaking laugh that had started it all. One of their grandchildren heard it and came running, wanting to know what was so funny, and soon all the children were gathered around, begging for stories. Cade told them about the first time he heard their grandmother laugh, about thinking it was thunder, about falling in love with a stubborn city woman who'd wandered into the wilderness alone. He told them about the storm that brought them together, the winter they survived, the life they'd built from nothing but determination and love. And as he talked, with Eleanor's hand warm in his and their family gathered close, Cade felt a peace so profound it brought tears to his eyes. This was legacy, he thought. This was what it meant to live a life well lived, not in grand gestures or fame or fortune, but in love shared and laughter given freely, and family built on the foundation of 2 people who chose each other every single day. When the sun began to set and the grandchildren were called home for dinner, Cade and Eleanor remained on the porch, wrapped in furs against the evening chill. The mountains rose around them, purple and gold in the fading light, and somewhere in the forest a wolf howled. "Do you hear that?" Eleanor said softly. "I do. That's the sound of the wild, the sound of the place that gave us everything." "No," Cade said, turning to look at his wife, at the woman who had transformed his lonely existence into a life full of purpose and joy. "You gave me everything. The mountains just brought you to me." Eleanor smiled and leaned her head on his shoulder. "Then I'm grateful to these mountains, and I'm grateful to that foolish girl who thought she could cross them alone, because without her, I never would have found you. And I'm grateful to the man who heard a laugh he thought shook trees," Cade said, "because he was smart enough to investigate, and lucky enough to find the woman who would become his whole world. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars came out one by one, filling the sky with light, and if anyone had been listening, they would have heard the sound of Eleanor's laughter, soft and content, drifting through the pine trees and out across the mountains that had witnessed their love story from the very beginning. It was the sound of joy, of home, of a life lived fully and without regret. It was the sound that Cade Mercer had spent 40 years making sure he heard every single day. And it was the sound that would echo through their family for generations, a reminder that love found in the most unexpected places is often the kind that lasts forever. As full darkness fell and the temperature dropped, they finally went inside, to the cabin that had been their sanctuary and their fortress and their home. The fire burned warm in the hearth, and the smell of pine and wood smoke filled the air. Cade banked the fire for the night while Eleanor prepared for bed, and they moved through the familiar routine with the ease of decades of practice. In bed, wrapped in each other's arms, Eleanor whispered, "Thank you for never getting tired of making me laugh." "Thank you for giving me something worth living for," Cade whispered back. And as they drifted off to sleep, surrounded by the evidence of the life they'd built together, neither of them could imagine being anywhere else or with anyone else. They had found each other in the wilderness, two lost souls who had somehow become whole. They had built a family, a community, a legacy of love and laughter. And every day, without fail, Cade had found new reasons to hear Eleanor's laugh, that magnificent, tree-shaking laugh that had captured his heart the very first time he heard it, and had held it captive ever since. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, and the mountains stood eternal watch. And inside, two people who had chosen love over loneliness, courage over fear, and each other over everything else, slept peacefully, their hands still intertwined even in dreams. The mountain man had found his purpose, and the woman who'd run from civilization had found her home. And between them, they had created something beautiful. A love story as wild and enduring as the land that had brought them together, a testament to the power of laughter and love, and the courage to reach for happiness even when it seemed impossibly far away. This was their story, written in the lines of their faces, told in the laughter of their grandchildren, preserved in the memories of a community they'd helped build. A story of two people who had been broken by life and made whole by each other. A story of finding love in the last place you expected it, and discovering that sometimes the best things come when you stop running and start living. And it all began with a laugh that shook the trees and a mountain man who couldn't resist finding out what kind of woman could make such a sound. The rest, as they say, was history, the kind of history that matters, written not in books but in hearts, passed down not through words but through the way one generation teaches the next what it means to love fully, laugh freely, and never, ever give up on finding your person, no matter how lost you might feel along the way.